No, no problem. Okay, I think we'll get started here just because we do have some material to go through. So, today we're going to be looking at the Third Crusade. This is going to be the last sort of significant crusade that we're going to be looking at. The last two classes we looked at the genesis of crusading, or the last three classes, I should say. We looked at sort of the start of the crusading movement, and then we looked at the First Crusade and the successes of that crusade in conquering Jerusalem and establishing a kingdom in the Holy Land called the Kingdom of Jerusalem and several other Crusader states. Then we looked at the Second Crusade, which was intended to help regain Edessa, which had fallen to the Muslims under Nur ad-Din. And the Third Crusade is called because between the Second and the Third Crusade, Saladin had taken Jerusalem. And he had done a pretty good job, if you'll remember, of mopping up the Crusader states as they were at the time. So you can see in this map here that at the time of around 1190, which is around the time of the Third Crusade, Saladin has conquered most of the previously Christian lands. The only pieces that are holding out are Tripoli and Antioch, and they're holding on kind of by a thread. They're just stuck on the coast, a little bit of territory, but Saladin is very successfully moved to capture the rest of it. The Kingdom of Jerusalem technically still exists, or I should say the kingship of Jerusalem technically still exists at this time. Nobody considers that the kingship has gone out, but the kingdom itself is really in name only. Saladin captures the king, or the last king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, and he captures many of the kingdom's high-ranking nobles and knights at the Battle of Hattin. And he proceeds to move very quickly to relegate the Christians to a secondary status and hopefully push them out of the Near East. But he's having some problems with that, and that's going to initiate the Third Crusade. So it's said that when the Pope, Urban III, heard that Jerusalem had fallen, he was so shocked he dropped dead. And his successor, a guy named Gregory VIII, who reigned for a very, very short 58 days, did the only significant thing that he did during his reign was to issue a bull calling for another crusade, which simply seems to be papal reactions to Christian setbacks in the Middle East, is to simply call for new crusades. And then he promptly dies. So the Third Crusade is really going to be sort of the A-list, A-team of crusades. This crusade is going to be led by the three most powerful, most respected monarchs of Europe. These are Frederick I Barbarossa of Germany. He's the Holy Roman Emperor. You have Philip II of France and Richard I, the Lionheart of England. This is going to be the best organized of the crusades. And what makes this crusade a little bit more interesting and a little bit more improbable is that these kings, generally speaking, don't get along. Medieval kings of France and England are traditional enemies, and they really don't get along. Remember, France and England have been had an adversarial relationship basically up until the First World War. So it's a traditional thing here, and we're well before the First World War here. So this traditional enmity between France and England is still going strong. And so the fact that Richard and Philip are able to kind of get together and agree to go on crusade, or to set things aside to go on crusade, is quite remarkable. And the Germans as well. The Germans generally are the enemies of the French. So traditionally you have England and France at war, and you have the Germans and the French at war. The French seem to be at war with lots of people. But that's just sort of the way these things go. So on this map, you can kind of see the routes that are taken by the various contingents in this crusade. So the English will send a fleet from Dartmouth, and it will go around Europe, and it will stop at Marseille to pick up the king and his army. Then King Philip will march overland to Genoa, and he will sail across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land as well. And the only people who are taking the traditional land route to the Holy Land are the Germans. They're the only ones who are taking that traditional route. Remember, every other crusade has gone by land. Germany is going by land, but the rest of these guys, they're going by sea, and it's actually a pretty smart decision. So generally speaking, the French and the English kind of have this loose connection where they're kind of traveling as a group, and the Germans are off on their own. They're their own contingent. So we're going to look at the German Crusade first. So Frederick I Barbarossa, he's called Barbarossa because of his red beard. Barber for beard, Rossa meaning red. Frederick Redbeard. He is 66 years old when he agreed to go on crusade. That is old for the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, your average lifespan for the average male is about 31 years old at this time. So if you made it to the age of 25, you had a chance of living till about 50. But most people, on average, the average lifespan for a man is 31. So Frederick is old for the standard of the time. Now, the reason he's made it this far is probably because he's very rich and he's very powerful. And of course, the rich and powerful always kind of do better at these things. Frederick is responding, or his response to the crusade is based on two things. Number one, he's responding to Gregory's bull, his call for people to come and join the crusade, but he's also responding to ambassadors who have been sent to him from the Holy Land to ask him for help. So he's really getting pressured from the Pope, and he's getting pressured from the Crusaders in the Holy Land themselves. Frederick, at the time that he's being lobbied, is at war with one of the German princes, an archbishop, whether you believe it or not. So he has to make peace with the archbishop before he can go on crusade, and this he does very quickly. And then he holds a diet or a parliament at the city of Mainz, not Worms. Remember, Worms is usually the place we see these things, but it's at Mainz this time. And he holds it at Mainz so that he can conclude peace in the Holy Roman Empire, get all the princes to say, we're done fighting, that's it, we're going to be at peace now, so that he can go on crusade and not have to worry about things at home. And it's at the Diet of Mainz that Frederick formally takes the cross, and he does this along with several other nobles in the Holy Roman Empire, including Duke Leopold V of Austria. And Duke Leopold is going to figure prominently later on in this story. So Frederick is a meticulous planner. He is a good general. He is a top administrator. He's been doing this for a very long time. And so unlike other crusades, he orders that a year-long preparation for war be commenced. And he commands his army to assemble at Regensburg in April 1189. So they have 1 year to assemble their forces, to get their equipment ready, to prepare all their resources, and to meet at Regensburg and then to set off. Now, Frederick is aware that past crusades have been pretty unruly. And so he decides that everybody who's going to participate in this crusade has to show up with at least 3 marks on him. 3 marks. A mark is of course the money of the time in Europe. It's a kind of a generic kind of currency, and that's approximately enough to support a person reasonably well for about 2 years. So it's quite a bit of silver. I think it's about roughly four-ish pounds of silver that each person had to bring. Frederick also levies a tax on Jews to help pay for the crusade, but he also puts the Jews of the empire under his protection. And this prevents the massacres and the Holocaust that we see take place with other crusades. That gets prevented here. That doesn't really happen in Germany this time, although it will happen in England, but it will not happen here in Germany. So Frederick he's also aware that past crusades have had problems just simply getting to the Holy Land. Marching to the Holy Land is a problem because you have to march through a variety of territories and you have to get different rulers to be on your side. And even though the local ruler might be a Christian, he might not be interested in letting your army pass. A large army, a foreign army, passing through your lands is a potential act of war. And so Frederick is proactive. He sends ambassadors to the different countries and principalities and kingdoms along his route, and he negotiates for rights of passage. And these ambassadors are pretty successful in getting these rights. The Byzantine envoy, however, because remember, the Byzantines have had problems with crusaders marching through their territory in the past, with looting and pillaging and all-out battles going on. The Byzantine envoy says, okay, fine, you can come through our territory, but you have to personally swear an oath of good conduct to pass through our territory. And the emperor himself did not swear this, but he had several of his nobles do it. And this is because an emperor like Frederick would not submit himself to a mere ambassador to swear an oath to some ambassador. Because that's just way beneath him. So he has several of his nobles do this. And he gets initial Byzantine agreement. Now, this will not last, but he gets initial Byzantine agreement. Frederick also sends ambassadors to Saladin himself. What is going on here? Saladin is the enemy. Frederick sends ambassadors to Saladin because Saladin and Frederick have a treaty of friendship that they have signed several years previously in 1175. And Frederick, being a chivalrous knight of the era, felt that he was honor bound to warn Saladin of his intentions. And basically, he issues Saladin an ultimatum. You will return the relic of the true cross of Christ, and you will return the conquered Crusader territories, and you will provide compensation for all the Christians you have killed in the wars with the Crusaders. If you do all of this, we won't be at war with you, and we'll just call it off right here. Now, Saladin, obviously, when you're faced with a deal this good, he really could turn it down. And he did. He turned it down in spades. So Frederick musters an army of about 12 to 15,000 people, soldiers rather, and this includes about 2,000 to 4,000 knights. And as he's moving through Hungary, there's going to be a contingent of Hungarians that joins him that adds another about 2,000 men to this army. So this is not as big an army as went out with the First Crusade, but this is a professional army, and there's a big difference between the two. So as we all say, the fun is in the journey and not in the destination. Frederick travels through Hungary without incident, and he is greeted warmly by Bela III, who is the king of Hungary. And after holding a series of courts and tournaments, as you do in the Middle Ages, to show that you have mutual respect with each other and you're entertaining each other, the king escorts Emperor Frederick through his land to the Byzantine border at the city of Belgrade. And here, Frederick writes a formal letter to the Byzantine emperor, a guy named Isaac II Angelus, informing him that he's at the border. His intentions are to move through, as previously stated. So he's doing everything he can to prevent problems with the Byzantines. He is working hard. No other ruler has done this. So the army initially starts through Byzantine territory with the support of local administrators and governors, but they're constantly assailed by bandits. That's a real big problem for them. Now, Frederick assiduously tries to keep out of politics in the Balkans because they're very complicated. That's nothing that has changed from then till now. Balkan politics are always difficult. It was the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck in the 1800s who said that the next great war was going to be caused by some damn silly conflict in the Balkans was going to cause the next big war, and the next big war was World War I, and he was absolutely right because it started in the Balkans. So the Balkans here, there's a war going on between Sicily and between the Byzantines, and Frederick doesn't want to get involved in this war. He's really on crusade. He's not here to pick a side or to get involved here, even though they try and pull him in. In particular, he rejected a proposal from the Tsar of Bulgaria because to take as the agreement of the Tsar of Bulgaria, to accept an agreement or an alliance with the Tsar of Bulgaria would be insulting to the Emperor Isaac, because the Tsar of Bulgaria is a claimant to the Byzantine throne. He says that he is the true emperor, and of course, if you make an alliance with him, you're making an alliance against the Byzantine emperor, and Frederick doesn't want to do that. So communication, though, between Isaac and Frederick is poor. Despite Frederick's assiduous attempts to calm Isaac's fears, Isaac is convinced that Frederick's objective here is to overthrow him and become the Byzantine emperor himself. This is ridiculous. There's no reason to think about this, but Isaac's a bit of a paranoid guy. And Isaac orders a local general in the area to harass the Crusaders by destroying their foraging and their supply lines, so limiting their ability to get food and supplies. Isaac's paranoia even leads him to try and conclude an alliance with Saladin against Frederick. So this is pretty big paranoia going on here. And the Germans eventually have enough of this, and they attack and they defeat all the Byzantine forces harassing them. They wipe them out. And the Byzantines continue to refuse them easy passage, in particular to allow them to cross the area known as Thrace, which is that portion. I don't know if you can see it. Well, we'll see it on the next map. Actually, I'll show you. But so Well, I'll just show you right now, actually. So this is, if you look at the green line here, that's marching overland. Frederick actually makes it into up to Adrianople, and he doesn't get to Constantinople. He has to turn around and go back to Adrianople, and he actually crosses the Bosporus, or he crosses over into Anatolia, well south of Constantinople. Other crusades had crossed at Constantinople, but he crosses well south of it because the Byzantines are so concerned about him. They don't want him anywhere near their city. So you can just see there sort of his zigzaggy route into the Holy Land. Um, but so Frederick eventually gets into Anatolia, and despite the promises of safe conduct that he had gotten from the Seljuk Turks, so the Seljuk Turks had agreed initially that they would let Frederick's army pass through their territory, they renege and they attack him, but he defeats the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Philomelion, even though he was outnumbered 5-1. So he's a very, very good general. He knows what he's doing. And he then proceeds to capture and sack the Turkish capital of Iconium. And if you remember, in the previous crusade, attacking and capturing the capital of the Turks was one of the objectives of the crusade. But they failed because they did not properly estimate the level of resources and the amount of time it would take to do that. But Frederick knows his stuff, and so he manages to conquer this. And then on June 10th, 1190, Frederick is crossing the Salif River, and his horse slips, and it throws him against a rock in the river, and he drowns. And the Germans are kind of left leaderless. They don't know what to do, really. They take his body to Antioch, and his body is defleshed, which means they take all the flesh off, they just keep the skeleton. And then his remains were taken to the city of Acre, where they were buried in the cathedral. The same cathedral. No, this isn't the same cathedral. Anyway, he was buried in the cathedral of Acre. And then most of the German army just simply picks up and they go home. Most of it, not all of it. Most of it picks up and goes home. Because remember, the German monarchy is elective. It is not hereditary. And so they have to go home to elect a new emperor. So that kind of ends the major German component of this. Not all of it. Remember, there are still some Germans with the crusade, but most of them go on back home. So the other part of this is the Anglo-French effort. So Henry II, if you remember way back when we talked about the king's rights and all that kind of stuff, Henry II is the king of England, and he has a son named Richard. So Henry is going to die. He's going to agree to go on crusade. He's going to die. But before he dies, he meets Philip II of France, and they settle all of their differences. So England and France, which had been at war, are now at peace. And then Henry promptly dies. And in 1189, he's succeeded by his son Richard, who becomes Richard the Lionheart, the great chivalrous medieval knight, the great king who we all know from those lovely Robin Hood stories. Richard and Philip both need to raise money to go on crusade. And they do this by implementing what is called the Saladin tithe. And this is a tax. So in England, the tithe was equated to 10% of one's revenue and movable property to be paid by all people, commoners, landowners, and clerics alike. So this was not a progressive tax. If you were poor, you paid 10%. If you were rich, you paid 10%. This tax could be avoided by signing up to go on crusade, and it was collected by church authorities. It was not collected by the state. So this led to a lot of conflict between the people and the church, not the state. So as the church, priests and archbishops are responsible for collecting this tax, or this tithe, if you will. You could, if you disagreed with your assessment, with the assessment of your property values, there was no board of revision you could apply to. You were simply imprisoned or excommunicated. It was a very simple thing. In fact, I think if, in the municipality, if we adopted that, it might get things done a little bit quicker. But, such is the times. The tax is extremely unpopular, as you can imagine. And because it raised, however, it was very successful. It raised approximately £82,000, which is the equivalent today of 167 million pounds, or 290 million Canadian dollars. That's rough. It's hard to equate medieval currency with real currency, but in general, that's what we would be looking at. So this was a successful tax as far as Richard was concerned. Now, Philip tries the same thing in France, but of course he's not as effective at it. Because as we've talked about before, the French government, or the French monarchy, is very decentralized. Philip has control over a province called the Ile-de-France, which is his personal territory. All the other parts of his power relies on the agreement of the nobility that governs the rest of the regions in France. So it's a very decentralized monarchy. And he wasn't as successful as Richard, but nonetheless, he imposed the same tax. So Richard has a dual method of getting to the Holy Land. So he takes a fleet of ships and he dispatches them to meet him in Marseille, which is in the south of France. And he's going to go overland. He's going to go and he's going to meet the King of France, and then they're going to march together and they'll board ships just on the Mediterranean coast, and then they'll sail the rest of the way to the Holy Land. Now, Richard's fleet takes a pit stop along the way. They stop over in Iberia, which again is going through the Reconquista, which is the reconquering of the land from the Moorish Muslims. And Richard's fleet helps the Crusaders, or I guess the Portuguese and the Spanish, fighting there. But they also attempt to loot Lisbon, which was a Christian city at this time. But the King of Portugal repelled them, and so they were not successful there. So anyway, his fleet takes a pit stop there, which is going to be a bit of an issue later on. So King Richard proceeds overland initially to the French city of Vézelay, which is a very nice French hill town. If you look it up on Google Maps, it's a very pretty, picturesque hill town. It has a very nice abbey, which is where I assume that they met. And he meets up with King Philip at Vézelay, and then they march together to Lyon, where they part ways and agree to meet in Sicily. So Richard goes to Marseille to meet his fleet, and Philip goes to Genoa, where he's hired a fleet of ships to sail him and his army to the Holy Land. Richard arrives in Marseille, and he finds that his fleet has not arrived. They took the pit stop. They're late. And he's not a patient guy. So he hires a new fleet of ships, and he sails to Sicily. And he does this as sort of a Mediterranean cruise. He stops at various places along the way, visiting people, doing pilgrimages, all the sort of things that a medieval king do. He's not really, once he's on the ship, he's okay with taking pit stops. But he doesn't like waiting for things. Who do you know who's like that? When he arrives in Sicily, he finds that his fleet has actually arrived there before him. So basically what happens is Richard gets to Marseille, his fleet isn't there, he hires new ships, and then they sail away, and as he's doing his little Mediterranean cruise along the coast of Sicily, his ships arrive at Marseille, and the people in Marseille say, no, he's gone, he's going to Sicily. And so his ships head down to Sicily, trying to catch up with him, and they get there before he does. So everything kind of ends up working out in the end. So when he's in Sicily, Richard finds that his sister Joan, who had been married to the King of Sicily, William II, has been imprisoned because William is not king anymore. He's been overthrown. And the new king is a guy named Tancred. And Richard is incensed at this poor treatment of his sister. And so he proceeds to conquer Sicily. And he does this very, very quickly and very efficiently. And he conquers the port of Messina, all the major cities in Sicily, and he does it within the span of like a couple of weeks. Tancred is then overthrown, and Richard now governs Sicily. So he's very good at what he does. He's a pretty good knight. Now, as you can imagine, any relationship with a French and an English monarch is going to be fraught with tension, no matter how friendly they are to each other in person. Remember, Henry VIII and Francis I of France actually wrestled together on the field of the Cloth of Gold. They had a great summit there, and they actually wrestled with each other. But nonetheless, they were great enemies. Richard initiated these new fractures by breaking his betrothal to Philip's sister Alice and promising to marry Berengaria of Navarre instead. Now, if you're going to have a daughter, I suggest you think of the name Berengaria. What a lovely name for a little girl. And now the reason for this breaking of the betrothal was because Alice, the sister of King Philip, had an affair with Richard's father, Henry II, before he died. So what happened was Alice and Richard became betrothed, and so Alice came to England to live with Richard's family. There was an affair between Henry II and Alice. Now, this meant that, as far as Richard was concerned, he couldn't marry Alice because that would be incest, because his father had already had relations with her. And so this led to a whole bunch of other rigmarole that, in the end, ended up with Richard refusing to marry Alice and instead marrying Berengaria of Navarre instead. Now, he marries Berengaria because Navarre is a little state on the south, right in the northeast portion of Spain. And Richard has territories throughout France. So he has Aquitaine, he has Gascony, he holds Normandy, he holds all these dukedoms and principalities. And by having Navarre on his southern border, that's helpful in defending against anybody who's going to try and invade him from the south. So it's a good relationship as far as he's concerned. Philip left Sicily shortly after he had arrived, and he sails directly to the Holy Land, and he arrives in April 1191. And he joins the ongoing Christian siege of Acre. So there's a siege going on of Acre by the Christians, and Philip arrives there to help out. Richard doesn't leave Sicily until late April. So Philip leaves early April, Richard leaves in late April. And as his ships pass Cyprus, they get caught in a storm. And this wrecked a couple of them on the rocks. And these ships carried some important passengers, including his sister Joan, his fiancée Berengaria, as well as a large amount of gold and treasure. Now, the ruler of Cyprus is a pretender to the Byzantine throne. Is another pretender to the Byzantine throne. And there's a lot of these things. And he captures the women and the treasure. And after meeting Richard, he agrees to return them all. He's going to return the treasure. He's going to return the women. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be fine. So Richard makes camp. He marries his fiancée. And the newly released king of Jerusalem, Guy of Lusignan, comes from the Holy Land to meet Richard on Cyprus. Now, the ruler of Cyprus is a guy named Isaac Ducas Comnenus. Once he gets back to his fortress, he promptly reneges on his promise, and he keeps all of Richard's gold. And Richard is very insulted by this reneging, and he proceeds to conquer Cyprus over the course of a few days. He conquers the whole thing. So it's not just he takes the city or he takes a castle or he takes the ruler and then leaves everything alone. He conquers the whole island. And then he proceeds to use this island as a supply base for the Crusade. And he would later sell this island to the Knights Templar, who would then also sell it to Guy of Lusignan, who would establish a kingship on Cyprus that would last until 1473. So Isaac himself, the great reneger, is eventually freed under an agreement with the Holy Roman Emperor, but he would be poisoned after failing to gain Turkish support to overthrow the Byzantine Emperor in around 1195, 1196. So he doesn't really end up working out well for him. He loses his territory and his life after this.
Poisoned him in why?
I think the Byzantines paid to have him poisoned. That's kind of the thing. So they can kind of get this guy out of the way. So Richard would continue to the Holy Land in June of 1191. So meanwhile, in Acre, we're going to go back a little bit. So Saladin has released Guy of Lusignan, the last king of Jerusalem, in 1189. Guy then attempts to reassert his authority as king over the former territories of Jerusalem and the former nobles of Jerusalem by going to the city of Tyre to take command of the remaining Christian forces who have gathered there. Now, Conrad of Montferrat has held Tyre against the forces of Saladin and is consequently seen as the great power holder in Tyre. He's the guy that everybody's following because he's managed to hold out this city against the great forces of Saladin mustered outside for a long time, whereas Guy has just been living in a sort of luxurious imprisonment this whole time. So Conrad was a claimant to the throne of Jerusalem. He's a rival against Guy for the throne of Jerusalem because he claimed to be closer in lineage to the two previous kings who were before Guy. That's Baldwin IV and Baldwin V. Guy was king only by courtesy of his marriage to Sibylla, who was the daughter of Baldwin IV. Conrad, to cement his claim, then goes on to marry Sibylla's half-sister Isabella. And that strengthens his claim to the throne, because not only is he now claiming I'm closer in lineage to the previous kings, but I'm also married to the daughter of the previous kings. So I have a better claim on this than you. Conrad literally shuts Guy out of Tyre. He's not allowed to enter the city. And so he decides that he's going to take what remaining forces he has and he's going to put the great city of Acre under siege and retake it from Saladin's forces. Now, the forces available to him are very, very limited. He's able to muster at most, at the high end, about 9,700 men. This is not a big army. And he was very dependent on these little armies and contingents that arrived periodically from Europe to help him. Remember, Crusaders are always straggling into the Holy Land. Not really ever in huge amounts, but always just sort of enough to keep things kind of running along. So this is a map. I'm just showing you here on a modern map of Israel where Acre is. So it's kind of in the north there, just to the west of the Sea of Galilee on the coast. And on the right is the old city of Acre. It's on that peninsula, a piece of rock jutting out into the Mediterranean. And that kind of gives you an idea of the strength of the fortified positions here. This is a pretty strong position. It is guarded on three sides by shoals, by rocks, by the seashore, and it only has one landward wall, which makes it much easier to defend than a traditional city. And this way, it very much mirrors Constantinople.
Was this their targets where they were going to have the Crusades?
Yeah, so this is going to be the first target of the Crusade. Okay. So Philip, yeah, so Guy is here. So when Philip arrives in the Holy Land, he's joining Guy, who's besieging Acre, and so in 1189, Guy begins his first attack, which is repulsed. He then moves to fortify his positions along Acre's border. So if you remember when we were talking about when Jerusalem was captured by the Romans, they encircled the city with fortifications. And Guy does the same thing here, except he does it on the landward side. So he puts a wall, fortified positions essentially, across the peninsula. And then he puts the city under siege. He has the advantage of freedom of movement on the seas. He can have ships coming to him from Tyre and from Cyprus and from other Christian territories to help him out. And he also gets an influx of up to 12,000 troops apart from the crusade that's coming. 12,000 troops eventually come into his army and kind of flood his forces. But the siege isn't working very well, and Acre doesn't seem very troubled. This is because it is also being resupplied by sea. Saladin is able to get ships in there occasionally, and so he can bring in new men and new material. So Saladin attempts to conquer Guy or destroy Guy's positions, but each time his attacks are repulsed. Guy then tries to counterattack Saladin, but his attack is unsuccessful. And so the casualties are high on both sides, and there's a stalemate. So you have to imagine, you have the city, then you have it being besieged by Guy, and Guy himself is being besieged by Saladin. There's a double siege going on here. This is a very interesting position. And neither side can budge the other side. The stalemate is characterized by an atrocious winter in 1190, which caused a great deal of death in the Christian camp. And it killed Sibylla, Guy's wife, as well as Guy's daughters, and many other soldiers. And in the Middle Ages, of course, the biggest killer of people is disease. It is not war. In 1190, the more Crusaders arrived from Europe and they enforced Guy. However, Saladin manages to conclude his siege of the castle of Beaufort, which is one of the great Crusader castles that has been holding out since the fall of Jerusalem. And now he's able to take all of his forces and concentrate on Guy. So the Christians, knowing that this is the case, they attempt to assault the city, to take the city before Saladin gets all of his guys in. And they are repelled because the defenders of Acre know how to use Greek fire, which is a sort of a tarish liquid that can be sprayed out from cannons that is impossible to put out by water. It's a very potent, lethal weapon. And it can burn on water. That's why you can actually set the sea on fire. So Saladin is successful in getting resupply ships into the city, and the stalemate continues. Now, this is when Duke Leopold of Austria arrives with the small group of crusaders from Frederick's army. These are the remaining Germans. And he takes over this campaign from Guy. And Saladin, knowing that Richard and Philip are on their way, decides it's time to break the Christian army before they can be reinforced even further. So in 1191, in February, Saladin does one big push, and he manages to temporarily break through the Christian line, but the Christians close it back up pretty quickly. They fill the breach, and that assault is unsuccessful. So in June, by the end of June 1191, both Richard and Philip have arrived at the siege of Acre. Philip having arrived in April, he begins to build siege engines at that time. Richard attempted to arrange a meeting with Saladin to try and negotiate an end to this, but he falls ill and he cannot meet. Also, Saladin refused to meet a king with whom he was at war. He said it was not proper for two kings to meet while they're at war, because then they can no longer be at war. Once you know each other personally in his mind, you can no longer war against each other. He's a chivalric guy too. He has a code of conduct as well. So this is an interesting thing. So Philip very much wants to press the attack on the city, but Richard, because he's ill and because not all of his men and equipment have arrived, he wants to hold back. Philip, on his own, he presses an attack on June 17th, but the garrison in the city had made a clever agreement with the army of Saladin. Basically, they said, anytime these guys breach the wall, we're going to send up a signal, and then you launch a massive attack all along the front and distract them. And when you distract them, we will fill the breach in the wall. We'll repair it. So that by the time they're able to turn back to the city, the breach has been filled. They can't exploit it. And so this is what they do over and over and over. They signal Saladin every time the Crusaders manage to breach the wall. So on July 2nd, Richard finally has his large siege engines ready, and they create a massive breach. And for whatever reason, Saladin fails this time to attack the Crusaders. But the Crusaders are repulsed by the defenders in the city. This is really not going well for either side at this point. So the city offers to negotiate a surrender. And Saladin says, okay, fine, we'll agree to that if we can have Conrad of Montferrat as the mediator. He knows Conrad from previous experiences. So Richard captures the entire Muslim garrison alive, and Duke Peter, or Duke Leopold of Austria, feels that since he was, in charge of this thing until Philip and Richard arrived, and since he is the senior imperial representative there, he should be treated the same as Philip and Richard. He should have his banner flying over the city the same as they do. Richard, of course, is indignant at this. He is a mere duke. He is not a king. I am a king. You are not equal to me, no matter who you are, no matter who you're representing. And so he orders that that Leopold's banner be torn down. And in fact, they do tear it down. They not only tear it down, but they throw it in the river. And this insults Leopold, and he does not forget this insult. Philip, at this time, decides to return to France. He's having some succession issues. One of his closest right-hand men, a guy named Philip the Count of Flanders, had died in the Crusader camp during the siege, and he needs to go and settle the succession to Philip's lands. He needs to settle that because those are very important lands, and so he cannot do that from the Crusader camp. So Philip up and leaves, and this leaves Richard in sole control of the expedition. He's the top dog now. So Richard goes to Saladin, and he says, we will exchange our prisoners that we've taken from the city in return for the return of the relic of the true cross, for 100,000 gold pieces, and for the return of 1,600 Christian captives held by Saladin. Saladin agrees to this, but Richard has set hard deadlines, and Saladin fails to meet them. But he's managed so far to pay several installments of gold, thinking that this will hold Richard at bay until he can get everything together. Richard, seeing that Saladin has not met the deadline, and that Saladin has not met the deadline, he's only paid a few installments, thinks that Saladin is stalling. He doesn't think that Saladin might be having trouble acquiring the required money. So he thinks that he's stalling. And in retaliation for this, he orders the execution of the Muslim captives in his custody. And so 3,000 people were marched up on top of a hill in full view of Saladin and his army and executed one by one. It was a bloody, bloody, bloody day. The blood ran ankle deep. It was absolutely terrible. And the Muslim army even attempted to assault the position to rescue these people, but they were repulsed. Saladin is infuriated by this. And Richard really does a number on his own men, or on the Christians that Saladin has taken. Because Saladin retaliates by massacring every single captive Christian that he had. This is thousands and thousands. This isn't 3,000. This is many thousands of people who are massacred all over Saladin's dominions in retaliation for this act from Richard. And nobody in history can describe why Richard does this. This is out of character for him. So nobody is quite sure why he does it. It doesn't make any sense because it puts Christians that Saladin has captured in jeopardy as well. So it's really a selfish move on Richard's part to have done this. It was stupid, frankly, and this is one of his missteps in the Holy Land. So after capturing Acre, Richard begins marching south to take the city of Jaffa. Saladin, however, intercepts him at Arsuf, about 30 miles north of Jaffa, and he attempts to harass Richard's column, but Richard is a good general, and he keeps his troops maintained. And so they stay in formation until finally a group of knights hospitler break ranks and they attack Saladin's flank. Then Richard, seeing that happen, just orders a full-on attack on Saladin's army. And Saladin's army suffers about 7,000 casualties, and they get repulsed big time. They outnumbered Richard in this case, but Richard defeats them. And this battle at Arsuf, really ends Saladin's reputation as being sort of being an undefeatable leader. This really does does a lot of damage to his reputation as a military leader. So then Richard takes the city of Jaffa as he intended, and this gives him effective control of the coastline and weakens Saladin's hold on Jerusalem. So Richard again, he attempts to open negotiations with Saladin, and Saladin sends his brother Al-Adil as his representative. And Richard, being the generous guy and doing what you do in the Middle Ages, he attempts to marry his sister Joan to Al-Adil as a sign of good faith. But this was rejected by Al-Adil, not by Joan. I don't think she was ever even asked. Negotiations fail, and Richard decides to march overland to Jerusalem. And he had heard that Saladin had been forced to disband most of his army under pressure from his nobles. Saladin's army has been in the field for quite some time, and his nobles they need their men back, kind of. So they need this manpower back so they can continue farming and all the things that you need to do with economic life in a feudal society. And so he's being pressured to disband his army and just kind of put this thing to rest. So this means that if Richard was able to siege Jerusalem, it would likely fall because Saladin's forces have been reduced here. And it's said that in Jerusalem the morale of the garrison and the people there was very low. That if he had managed to siege Jerusalem, it probably would have fallen to him very quickly. So Richard gets to a point about 12 miles outside the city, but he hits very bad weather, including hailstorms, cold weather, rain, and it slows his army down. And Richard also becomes concerned that if he puts siege to Jerusalem, that it will motivate the Muslims to gather a relief army and cut him off. So they'll move around him, cut him off from his base at the sea, and massacre his army. And to try and counteract this, he asks Conrad of Montferrat, who is at Tyre, to send additional troops to help him out. But Conrad refuses, and because he is insulted by Richard. Richard has insulted him by supporting Guy of Lusignan for the kingship of Jerusalem over Conrad. So Conrad's not going to help Richard. So then Richard decides to turn around and march back to the coast, which was probably a mistake on his part, but nonetheless, that's what happens. So in Jaffa, there's a council of nobility from the kingdom that they elect Conrad as their king. Guy gets 0 votes in this election, and Richard is forced to accept that Conrad is the new king of Jerusalem. But Conrad was assassinated about 8 days, or about 2 days after this happens. And it's said that Richard paid a group called the Assassins to murder Conrad. And this is the rumor. We don't know if it's true, but it's the rumor that kind of circulated throughout the camp and made its way back to Europe. Because Richard and Conrad hated each other. Richard will move on to Ascalon instead. He'll fortify the city. And in 1192, in June, Richard tries to attack Jerusalem again. And his idea is that first what we'll do is we'll attack Egypt. That's Saladin's power base. That's where he gets all his resources, all his men. We'll attack there. That's his richest supply area. But the Duke of Burgundy, who has taken over leadership of the French contingent, says, no, we should assault Jerusalem directly instead of this roundabout going through Jerusalem thing. Richard, seeing that the leadership is split, understanding that this kind of split effort could not succeed, he agrees, okay, fine, we'll go to Jerusalem, but I will only go as a simple pilgrim. I will not go as a general. I will not lead this thing. And faced with this split leadership and the potential resignation of their top leader, the attack was actually unable to succeed. So the army retreated to the coast once again. And then in 1192, in July, Saladin's army launches a massive sudden attack on Jaffa, and they capture it. His army, still incensed at the massacre of Acre, rampages through the city, killing any Christian they could find. And Saladin, it's even said, advised the Christians of Jaffa to shelter in the citadel until he could get control of his army back. Richard sails his army to Jaffa from Ascalon, and he launches a seaborne attack that took the Muslim forces completely by surprise and forces them to leave the city, even though he only had about 2,000 men with him. Saladin tries to counterattack, but despite having numerical superiority, he fails. And this strengthens the Christian position on the coast and helps secure it. This is kind of like the last breath of Saladin. He's put all the steam into it, and there's nothing left. So in the endgame, in September of 1192, Richard and Saladin agree to a treaty, which allowed Jerusalem to remain under Muslim control, but also allowed for Christian pilgrims to, unarmed, visit the holy sites, and for Christian traders to do business in the city. Richard agrees in a return to return Ascalon to Saladin, with its defenses destroyed. So he's going to destroy the castles and the walls there, but he'll give Ascalon back to Saladin, because Ascalon is an important port to get to Egypt. There's it's an important link for Saladin. So the agreement is a compromise. It does not please the public on either side of the conflict. Europeans felt very disappointed that Richard did not pursue the taking of Jerusalem despite being so very close, and Muslim observers were disappointed that Saladin had failed to push the Crusaders from Syria and Palestine. And on that map there, you can see how things ended up after this was concluded. The Kingdom of Jerusalem is that purpley, mauvey, blue thing, and you can see that it basically controls the coastline from Jaffa up to Beirut. The county of Tripoli is there, Antioch is there, and Cyprus is established as a new kingdom under the Lusignan dynasty. So that's what the Christian kingdoms look like at this time. So this crusade is kind of is the most successful militarily, because it establishes the Crusader states that it establishes are a little bit more stronger and wealthier than they were when they fell apart the first time. So this state is probably stronger and wealthier than the previous kingdom of Jerusalem. But again, these won't last very long. But nonetheless, that's what happens. Richard secures a pretty good peace with Saladin, and Saladin will die about 2 years after this peace is concluded. So, in 1192, on his way home, Richard is wrecked. He is shipwrecked on the coast of Italy. And he disguises himself as a Templar because he is in hostile territory. And he's trying to get to the territory of his brother-in-law. And so if he can just stay in disguise long enough, he can get there without being seen. But as he is going through Austria, Duke Leopold of Austria, near the city of Vienna, captures him. And remember, Duke Leopold had felt very insulted by Richard several ways. Number one, the banner thing, the status thing, and also the supporting of Guy of Lusignan over Conrad. Conrad is related to Duke Leopold. So there's three slights that have been done against Leopold in his own mind by Richard. And so he decides to take Richard captive. And he also believes that Richard has murdered his cousin Conrad as well. So this is quite the vendetta for him. He holds Richard in Dürnstein Castle, the ruins of which you can see there. And in March 1193, he hands Richard over to the Emperor Henry VI of Germany. Henry demands a huge ransom for his return, 150,000 marks. So if you remember that 4 pounds of silver is 3 marks, think about how much money. That's a lot of money. And this is about 3 times the annual income of the English Treasury. So if you think about 3 times the annual revenue of Canada, that's a big ransom. We wouldn't pay that for Justin Trudeau, I'm guessing. But England is willing to pay that, or they have to pay that for Richard. Otherwise, he's going to be stuck in jail.
He left him there, right?
No. And that's where we're going to come to. So Richard is in jail. He's captured by Henry VI. Generally, when a king is in jail, in the Middle Ages, he's treated very well. He has a large retinue. He's allowed to move about the grounds. He can go hunting under guard. He gets a lot of good food. It's basically a very, very nice hotel stay. But Henry and Richard and Leopold don't like each other at all. And Richard complains about the circumstances of his confinement. He says that the chains that he is put in are heavier than anything that has ever been put on a horse or on an ox. He is He is bound in chains. These are not even gold chains or silver chains. When he captured Cyprus, he put the ruler of Cyprus in silver chains because he had promised not to put him in iron chains. So he put him in silver chains. But he doesn't even get silver chains when he's in Germany. He gets put in iron chains. And he is stuck like this for 2 years. And eventually his ransom is paid, and he is released in 1194, and he dies 5 years later in 1199 by being shot through the eye with a crossbow bolt at a siege in Limoges in France. So, and he was 41 when he died, so he relatively young king. Now, I think it behooves us to do an assessment of Richard the Lionheart, because historically he gets a he gets a pass historically in terms of his kingship. If we go to the old stories of Robin Hood, who is the bad king? It's King John. He is the bad king. Who is the good king? It's King Richard. When Prince John is evil and greedy and oppressing people, who comes back from the Crusades to save everybody? It's good King Richard. He comes back and he establishes government back. But we have to assess this historically because it's not quite right. Richard's reputation is as one of a chivalrous knight, a great king, merciful, generous, great warrior, etc. And this has been driven largely by the myths of Robin Hood and his battle against Richard's greedy younger brother John and the evil sheriff of Nottingham. Now, a sheriff is a royal officer in a county. He's charged with enforcing the king's rule in the county. That's his job. There are sheriffs all over England. So there's still actually a sheriff of Nottingham today. That's still an office that exists. But it's important that we understand a few things about Richard that will change your mind, or may change your mind, about him as a king. While he's a very successful and talented military leader, he was not really the great defender of English commoners and peasants. He spent no more than 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. 6 months out of 10 years. He preferred his French territories. He was much more enamored of French culture and the French language and French food. He preferred France over England. It was just a far nicer place. And this is true of many kings in England. Many kings of England who have had territories in France have hated England because it's cold and it's damp and the food isn't as good and the cities aren't as respected. Paris, even at this time, is a center of culture and fashion and learning. London is kind of a cattle town, still seen as a cattle town by the European lords of the day. And so Richard really prefers France. Richard, remember, imposes a very harsh 10% tax on all the people of England to fund his crusade, no matter how rich or poor you were. When he's captured, the ransom of 125,000 marks had to be raised with a 25% tax on all property and revenue. Again, there's no tax bracket here. The poor are overpaying. So if we think about it, 25% to a poor person versus 25% to a rich person is a different thing entirely. But Richard, through his regents, which is Prince John, who's ruling England at this time in his stead, and his mother Eleanor, they have to raise this money. And so they impose this tax to raise it. Richard even offered at one point that he would sell London if he could find a buyer for it to fund his crusade. But who would buy London, right? So he sees England as a cash cow. England is, at this time, a prosperous country. So he sees it as a cash cow, but he doesn't really respect it at all. And in his urgent need for money and his urgent need to prosecute these crusades and to fight wars in France, it's up to his brother, John, to raise this money from the English people. And John ends up with the bad reputation because he's the one who has to enforce these things. And John is not well loved. He's an abrasive person. His name, when he is a prince, his name is John Lackland because his father didn't have any land to give him. He got nothing from his dad. He was kind of a mama's boy. But John was an able administrator, but he was very abrasive. He wasn't a nice person. He would insult people to their faces, and he was a little bit greedy. But it's because of Richard. It's because of Richard's need for money that John has to impose the taxes that he imposed. So while John might still go down in history as an unloved king, he doesn't deserve the reputation as being the superly greedy king that he gets in sort of our modern mythology. And there you have, but Richard is the one who gets the good reputation. There you see him on a horse. That's a statue outside the Houses of Parliament in Westminster. That's a great Victorian statue, and you can see Richard there, ever the great king of the Middle Ages, imposing, very fit and strong, very manly, leading his armies forward. So in any case, that is the Third Crusade. It was probably the most successful crusade militarily, the one that was conducted with probably the most competence out of all of them, but it was the one with perhaps, even though it had a successful result in the end, securing Christian territory in the Holy Land, it had a result that nobody really liked. There was no side was really entirely happy about what happened here. So anyway, that's our talk on the Third Crusade. Are there any questions or comments?
In the end, did they succeed anything? Seems they gave back, or I know they got his free access without weapons to go visit the Holy Land.
Yeah, and that's kind of initially like the original reason for the crusade. In fact, is because they were saying that Christian pilgrims were being assaulted in the Holy Land, and so we needed this crusade to secure the pilgrim routes and secure the holy sites. So the whole point of the original crusading movement is to secure free access to these cities for Christians, and then it kind of turned. And then as part of that, it's like, well, why don't we just take the city and secure it for Christians, right? So yeah, I would say like the crusading movement in general did not really succeed at all, because in the end, the whole thing just falls apart. And as we know today, even though there are significant old Christian communities in the Middle East that survived until now, the Christian kingdoms in the Middle East didn't really last very, very long at all. So, and the success of the Crusader kingdoms depended on a constant, steady trickle of knights and crusaders coming in, always coming in. Sometimes, you'd have a few nobles who would send a few hundred men out there for a few years, or they'd pay, or you'd have some dukes, like some English barons would pay for the construction of a castle in the Holy Land or something like that. But beyond that, these territories are really always hanging on by a thread. It's kind of like these companies that, it's like Amazon not turning a profit for the first 10 years of its existence simply to undermine its competitors. Except Amazon was successful, the Crusader kingdoms not so much. So, yeah, I mean, eventually it wasn't terribly successful at all. And in fact, I think, in the end, what ended up is that these Muslim rulers, in the end, under the Ottomans, Christians were given access to these sites in Jerusalem. Anyway, these holy sites. So, in the end, this turned out to be a bit of a waste of time. But
I forget where it was, sort of back. A knight conquered earlier, one of the second or third strike, conquered a region because he was there.
yeah, Richard, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, but he never left anybody behind to protect it.
He did initially, yeah. So he held Cyprus, and then he turned it over to a new ruler, who was Guy of Lusignan, or he sold it to Guy of Lusignan because he was friends with Guy, like he supported Guy. And when the nobles of Jerusalem said, well, we don't want Guy as our king anymore, Richard kind of compensated him by selling him Cyprus. And so Guy was able to establish a Christian dynasty on Cyprus.
And he did maintain control over it.
Oh yeah, he did. Yeah, same thing with Sicily. I believe he sold Sicily to, I can't remember who he sold Sicily to, but he did turn over Sicily as well. But he conquered along the way. Definitely, he was very, very successful at that. Definitely didn't want to insult his sister. So, all right. Well, next time we will conclude the Crusades. We'll look at the 4th, 5th, and 6th Crusades all in one class. They will not be very extensive at all because none of them really succeeded at all. And then after that, we will look at the Inquisition. And then the class after that will hopefully start looking at medieval theology, which we haven't looked at yet. So as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and we'll hopefully see you next week.